Hey everyone, welcome back to Coding Temple's Agile Leaders, where we develop skills and strategies to increase velocity and innovation in a growing organization. I'm your host, Evan Shai. Today we're joined by Dr. Jim Kanichirayil, co-founder and co-host of multiple podcasts and VP of Growth at Engage Rocket. Jim has certainly become my go-to expert on all things development and retaining top performers in growing organizations. So thank you for being with us, Jim.
Yeah, happy to be on. And I think my 2 cents on this would be if I'm your go-to resource for retention and development, we're going to have some problems.
Your top 10. There you go.
I can live with that.
All right. Why don't we start out by giving the audience a sense of your journey to Engage Rocket and some of the work that you're doing there?
I've always been in HR tech or TA tech throughout my career. So I've always been obsessed with why people join and leave organizations, to the point that my doctoral research is on that specific topic. And I've always been in talent or talent adjacent spaces. If you're building a high performance team, which is something that we always talk about, both formally and informally throughout all the different platforms that I'm yapping on. When we look at how that relates to the Engage Rocket role, it's a problem that a lot of leaders are struggling with. The question is, how do I find the best people? How do I develop them? And how do I retain them? There's an interesting shift where the legacy mindset was, let's just find more people. Now you're seeing a bigger emphasis on how do I keep the people that I have and develop them so they can propel my growth. And that's what Engage Rocket helps address from a systems perspective. And we are one element of a 3-pronged approach that you should be taking. So if you're looking at any solution as the sole answer to a problem, that you're just going to make whatever problem that you have worse. So when we look at Engage Rocket, I'm responsible for driving growth into the US market for our platform. And what we do is performance management, employee engagement, and leadership effectiveness and readiness.
Fascinating, man. Your journey has been interesting as well. Seem to have touched a lot of different things, and particularly have developed a muscle for creating valuable content and meaningful conversations. Before we dive into some of the meaty topics that we're gonna dive into today, can you give me a sense of just what skills have been the most impactful for you throughout your career?
So the lens that I bring to this conversation is that of a startup and scale up guy. And when you're typically in those spaces, you have to be the ultimate generalist. Simon Sinek had mentioned that the quote about a jack of all trades is a master of none is often viewed as a negative, but the full quote talks about the fact that a jack of all trades is actually oftentimes better than somebody that's just a master of one trade. And that's what makes me effective in the spaces that I'm in. I have a fair amount of depth across a number of different areas, and that's served me well in highly agile, high growth organizations, because you need to have a lot of different capabilities get to the next level. So when I think about the skills, it's more around mindset. I'm just generally showing up in a way, both personally, professionally, in ways that are extremely curious. And I want to be constantly learning. Live as if you'll die tomorrow and learn as if you'll live forever. And that drives sort of my career arc. It drives how I show up. And that's probably the most valuable skill that I can point to that's led me to where I'm at right now.
I absolutely love that, man. As someone who also has spent most of my career in the $0 to $1, $0 to $10 million journey, at least on the startup side, small, scrappy organizations, being a generalist was a strong suit. And I think for a while, being a generalist is seen potentially as a negative relative to really specialized technical abilities, or at least you always relied on those other attributes as part of the team to build a well-rounded organization. But I think increasingly, the appreciation for generalists' adaptability is growing, and I think with AI, maybe even increasingly so. So interesting to hear you articulate it that way, and I didn't know that about the quote that is often shared with insufficient context around it, or at least not the full quote.
Yeah, I kind of paraphrased the second half of it, but the full quote is great.
All right, so diving into some of the other stuff, set the stage here for us a little bit. What are some things that leaders should have in mind if they're looking to better retain and develop their people? You started to see a couple things it sounded like.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at questions that to better develop and retain your people, there's sort of four things that I point to. When you look at your current organization, you have to ask yourself, if it's important for me to build an organization where I've shown a capacity to retain and develop people, does my organization reflect that? How many people are in your organization that you can say, well, this person started here and now they're this different level in this different silo? How are you demonstrating that social proof of growing and developing your own? So you need to get granular and have an understanding across all levels of your organization and ask yourself, how often are development conversations happening? And your leadership team, however you define it, how often are they having development conversations with people that report into them, centered on what's important for that person that's sitting across from them to get them to the next level? How often is that happening? It's not enough to have that conversation. How often are you taking that conversation and putting it into action and being intentional about it? And this is where a lot of things go wrong, because we have this business mindset in the broader world of work that employees are responsible for their own development. We know what our day-to-day looks like at every level of the organization. Most organizations are running super thin. So in the relentless list of tasks that you have on your plate, how realistic is it to just abdicate your responsibility for development and telling the employee who's already buried with a bunch of stuff, hey, you're in charge of this too, so come back to me and report back to me on what you figure out? That is a fundamental dereliction of duty as a leader. If you're not taking those development conversations and working alongside your employees to put it into action, that's a failure on you. And then the last question that you need to ask, if you care about building a development and retention culture in your organization, if you're at the executive and senior levels of leadership, you have to ask yourself, how am I supporting my frontline managers in the execution of this culture? If you're saying this is important, but you're not putting resources at the line level to support it, that's where the work is done. You're running your business off of hopes and dreams and versus actually putting it into action and demonstrating to your people that this stuff matters to you. So those are the four things that leaders need to be asking to build this sort of organization.
It seems intuitive that both the challenges of doing it the way it's always been done, as well as why it logically makes sense to think about it differently, and did a good job in articulating it the way that you did in terms of how you should be thinking about those questions. Why do you think it has been challenging for companies of all sizes to really shift their perspective and focus more on retention of talent versus just hiring new talent to bridge skill gaps within the organization?
So that's going to be a difficult question to answer. It's a multifaceted problem. It's not a linear problem that you're trying to solve. When you're talking about, hey, I want to build a development and retention culture, there's a lot of factors that go into solving for that. And honestly, I think one of the things that we are faced with from a legacy perspective is that Jack Welch school of business, where it says maximize shareholder value, replace 10% of your workforce every single year, regardless of historical precedent. Let's run as lean as possible. Let's strip away anything that is considered fluff in terms of the employee experience so that we can be as profitable as possible. That's part of the reason. So when you look at those factors, you look at the complexity in building a development and retention culture and compare it with what do you have to solve for from a hiring perspective? You have to find people, get them to apply, interview them, and then hire them. And that's why we've been in this constant sort of hamster wheel. I call it the talent attraction hamster wheel, where we're rooted in this leadership and organizational mindset that, we don't need to worry about what's in our house. We can always find more people. Mindset is enabled by what we've seen over the last 20, 40 years in this era of free money, where you could afford to just have a revolving door in your organization because it's an acceptable cost of doing business. Leaders need to confront how much dead money they have on their books by not solving for development and retention. This is an element in my research. Now, some of this might be dated from the time that I did my doctoral research, but for every instance of turnover that you have, you can spend up to 250% of that individual's annual salary in replacement costs, hard and soft costs. It's much easier to ignore it because it's complex and focus on let's just hire that to structurally fix those issues and build a development and retention culture. It needs to be embedded at all stages of your employee life cycle. And now you're starting to get like, why has that been ignored? The complex problem is always going to be deprioritized versus the simple problem.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's like people understand and have seen enough case studies to understand the costs and consequences of having poor retention or having this posture to go higher instead of retain and develop talent. Yet few organizations have a real analysis happening internally that is elucidating with accuracy the replacement costs of employees. So it's not in our face. So it's easy to fall back into the natural reflex of finding the people out there to try and fill gaps that you have.
And I'll take it one step further, because a lot of the conversation that we're having right now is approached from a HR talent acquisition lens. The stuff that we're talking about right is all employee lifecycle stuff. One of the gaps that exists is that when you look at who is leading organizations from the C-suite, it's only a recent occurrence that people from the people and culture space even got a seat at the table. Leaders of organizations at the C-suite come out of finance, sales, operations, and have never really spent any time in the trenches from an employee lifecycle perspective. So they know the theory of it, but the practice of actually executing, they're disconnected from. So you don't know that space, you're going to be less likely to actually put in things that are coming from the people that own that function. Gets deprioritized all the time.
In your research, have you seen any interesting comparative case studies of companies that are over-indexed or sufficiently indexed on culture and employee development? I know the American Opportunity Index has a nice index of companies who have really strong mobility internally, versus companies that on the other end of the spectrum don't have those things, but still are high-performing organizations. Have you seen anything like that?
I don't know how real this is anymore, but there are a couple of organizations that I remember working with that had a pretty good track record of growing their own and having some solid tenure as a result. One of them is ITW, Fortune 50 or 100 publicly traded organization. They have a decentralized model, so they have a bunch of different business units that roll into the umbrella, and across the organization, they're consistently rated as one of the best places to work, and they have a track record for employee retention and development. There's another company, I think it's WD Gore, the same company that makes Gore-Tex. They were known for having a strong matrixed organization, a culture that communicated to their employees that think of your career as a lattice versus a ladder, had a lot of internal mobility and had a track record for retention and development. So those are two that come to mind from when I was doing my research back in the day.
Super helpful. And what I just find valuable, and maybe American Opportunity Index has some of this research, it's ultimately how can we make the most compelling case to folks who are optimizing organizations for shareholder value, ultimately profitability, long-term free cash flow. How can we draw the causal relationship between talent retention and development and those outcomes, that it is truly in the best interests of the interests that these folks have already identified? I think there's a strong case there, and we'll have to circle back one time, maybe do an episode just on drilling into that particular research.
So there's one thing that I want to add on that I'm making. I'm obviously an advocate for retention and development because I think it's better for the bottom line of organizations. The central issue with many organizations is that they don't tell the truth about the expectations. If you are a maximize shareholder GE model type organization, you can't make the case when you're recruiting people, we're like a family here. One of the organizations that does this really well actually comes out of staffing is Onan Group. And I interviewed their CEO earlier this year, and what they do is that they're upfront in terms of the reality of working in their organization, and they're one of the best rated staffing organizations out there. And what Jim Weaver, who is the COO there, said is that, when you come into our organization, we're clear with you that we have a 3-year plan for you. So we want to understand what your vision for yourself is from this point until 3 years from now, so we can help you achieve those things. And if at that time you decide that you want to see what the next 3 years looks like, then great, we'll do that. But understand, this is a day one conversation. Our number one priority is to enable you to get to where you want to be, independent of and help you get to that next stage. If you're out front that way and you're saying, hey, we're typically an organization that has a shelf life of 18 to 36 months that people tend to stick around, if you're upfront with that, people will always be okay with you being straight with them. People will have issues if you tell them one thing and you do another.
Totally. Yeah. And even, people's memories sometimes remember different realities. So maybe some degree of that conversation happens, and then there's inconsistency down the road. However, to your point, by being upfront and trying to optimize for alignment transparently right out of the gate, at the very least, it is increasing the probability of self-selection into an aligned culture, that you can assume that at least some of that is happening through the interview process if you are sufficiently transparent with what the experience looks like on the other side of the hire. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. And a lot of organizations and leaders fail on the transparency side of it. There's somebody that I talked to, Yasmin Duncan, who's the chief people officer for Magnolia Bakery. One of the things that he brought to was the concept of giving the PIP up front. And when you hear PIP, everybody's listening and thinking, oh crap, this has got to be a toxic environment. And that's not the case. What she means is if organizations were more clear about the expectations are at the job level, at the function level, at the team level, at the project level, and you worked with your manager to find out, hey, this is my working style, this is my preferred work style. If you had those conversations from application through onboarding, how much better off would you be in terms of setting up your employees for success? And the problem is that a lot of leaders and organizations don't have that level of transparency. And they should. They would solve a lot of these problems by having the space, or at least offering the space for people to self-select in or out based on what the actual truth is about the organization.
I absolutely love that. I think so much of our interviewing selection process is oriented around technical aptitude, technical skills. And I saw some interesting research a couple weeks ago. It was a couple thousand HR professionals, but it was like 89% of the time of a new hire failing in the first 18 months was because of interpersonal challenges, not because of technical abilities. Interpersonal challenges could ultimately be synonymous with a lack of consistency between the picture that was painted on the front end and what was actually happening, or the work environment and context that the person's actually coming into, and their ability to navigate and perform within that. I know you guys don't spend a ton of time on the onboarding aspect, but is there any advice you can offer for leaders to try and do their best to, and I think you maybe just shared a little bit of it, but try to be transparent with that process, or what the work environment and culture will be like early on, and what they should be looking for in candidates that are suggestive of and consistent with trying to create a continuous learning environment inside the organization?
So I'll tackle the first bit first. When you look at what should leaders be doing from an onboarding perspective, I hinted at this earlier. This is a simple people and process equation. So you should be able to do this, and I would highly recommend that you do this at any stage of organizational development. That onboarding phase, you need to make sure those first 90 days you are building clarity of communication and expectations, and you're coming to agreement between you and the employee on what that looks like. Oftentimes what happens in organizations, and there's like, if you want to solve for development and retention, onboarding is critical, because the onboarding experience that somebody has is a massive predictor of your ability to retain them within their first year. So you can't relegate onboarding as a process to just form filling and then stick them in front of your LMS and have them figure stuff out. What needs to be done is you need to integrate them into the organization. You need to integrate that new hire, have them meet across the organization, and especially with their direct manager, figuring out work styles, job expectations. When you look at the most common reasons why somebody leaves an organization, you're looking at the top 5 reasons. 2 out of the top 5 reasons are typically manager related. So if you and your manager aren't aligned, you as the employee have a high likelihood of exiting the organization because of that lack of alignment. So when you're looking at best practices, it's got to be people and process oriented integration into the organization, but most of that time should be all about transparency, expectation setting, clarity of expectations, and especially aligning on work styles between you and the manager. And that's going to have payoff in terms of your ability to retain. Ignore this at your peril, and startups will do this anyways because they're running so fast. If you want to get to that next stage, do this. Take the time. This is one of those. You need to slow down on your onboarding process and make sure that you're gaining alignment with that employee so that you can speed up later. Because if you don't have that people and process part of the equation down and you decide, oh, I'm going to get some technology to solve this later, you're going to have a bigger mess to deal with.
Love that, man. Let's now take it further into the employee life cycle. You have a growing organization, you have folks already on board. How do you cultivate an environment where continuous feedback helps team members, especially those who are less experienced, to advance or develop more rapidly?
So if you're looking at building a development culture within your organization, that battle is won or lost at the front lines and specifically with your managers. So the question that I ask is, how have I equipped my frontline managers with the knowledge, skills, and abilities to understand what good looks like, what good leadership looks like, and how that flows down to their individual reports? And that's an important question to ask, because oftentimes what happens, when you try to answer it, one of the questions that comes up is, how often are your managers having one-on-ones with their team? What's happening in those one-on-ones? In a lot of instances, managers that are having one-on-ones use those one-on-ones as status reports or metrics reviews and stuff like that. It's completely unproductive. It could have been an email. If you really want to impact your ability to gain a development culture, you need to have one-on-ones structured in a way where you're talking and aligning with that employee about problems that they're facing, how to overcome those, and what their vision for the future looks like, and how you're going to work together to help them achieve that vision for the future. So it needs to be a development conversation. Chris Williams, who's a former VP of HR at Microsoft, often talks about this. So if you aren't following him, check him out. And you have to have those development conversations embedded into your week-to-week habits. And then if you're looking at, well, how do you create the culture where you can have more of these? You need to be creating the mechanisms or processes and putting that into place where just-in-time feedback or point-in-time feedback is readily available. You can't over-engineer the process where something happens and your manager is handcuffed in being able to respond and address and coach on it because there is a bureaucratic process in place. So if you're looking at doing this, how do you build a feedback culture? That's step one. Step two is actually taking that feedback and putting it into action. And we can cover that in a second, but I want to stop right there so that we can flesh this out a little bit more if we need to.
This is particularly relevant even inside our own organization. We're at that size now and starting to grow where we have some HR, but we don't have software systems to support and create a consistent and reliable process that truly empowers, to your point, frontline managers, which I think is so powerful and such a mindset shift required for leaders 25, 0 to 40. And now you're starting to have managers with teams and maybe even an additional layer underneath that. You can no longer be thinking about it. What are we just doing as leaders? How many one-on-ones are we having at the top of the organization? Of course, that needs to be cascading throughout the organization. And we need a way of creating transparency with how those things are going and true feedback that can inform how we continue to improve as leaders at the top and the organization as a whole. So that more of just commentary in terms of value that I'm capturing from your insights, but by all means, let's keep drilling in.
I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is that you don't necessarily need to have a technical system in place to go and capture this and extend on this. You have to build the habit first. That's the first, focus on building the cadence of those one-on-ones and then acting on those one-on-ones based on what you find. And if that can easily be done through like a Google sheet or a spreadsheet or whatever. If you have no system in place, and then you feed that into your HRIS over time, that at least gets you there. But the value of all of that, it's not just to do the thing. Like I want to reset the why behind it. When you look at the broader world of work, the amount of productivity that's lost every year is somewhere between 450 billion to 550 billion every single year, and due to lack of employee engagement. So what is employee engagement? It is demonstrating to your employees that you actually give a crap about them and what's important to them. And if you're never talking to them about what their vision for success, their vision for the future, how this role in this company connects to that vision that they have for themselves, that's the purpose of a one-on-one. If you're not doing the one-on-one and you're not doing it with that frame that connects that employee's future vision to the current state, that's a failure. It's not about doing the thing. It's about why you're doing the thing. And that's what gets missed. There's so much money that's left on the table because we refuse to treat our people like people. We think it's just plug and play and run it on autopilot. And then we wonder why there's a revolving door and we never have enough people to do the things that we want to do as an organization.
But even developing the muscle, we've had a strong muscle internally at a level of the organization. But how do you ensure that that continues to kind of cascade throughout each level of management without some type of software technology that provides visibility and can provide guidance into the structures or ways that those one-on-ones can happen productively?
So there's a couple of different ways that you can handle this. I'm going to give you the bootstrapped way, and then that's only going to be effective to a certain size of an organization. So if the thing that you're trying to solve for is building the muscle for the thing that you're doing and creating the habits, and then you want to actually have visibility, you can create a shared drive or document where everyone is accountable for activity and you action items that listed out of, you can feed that into your HRIS. That's the first system that comes into place. Just spreadsheeting your way to success. Once you get beyond a certain size of an organization, you're going to need to have a system in place, but that system's going to fail if you don't have the habit in the first place. So build the habit first. You can bootstrap it with no cost. You just have to do the thing and build a checklist of what good looks like. That's up to senior and executive leadership to demonstrate that and then hold the line accountable for that. So that should be a topic of conversation that comes up in your one-on-ones as a leader to a manager. And then you hold your managers accountable for those development things with their employees. And what does Joe have on his radar for development for this quarter? What does Jane have on their radar as a leadership team? Those are questions that we should be asking. And that's a no tech way of doing it. Sure. Now, when you get to that side where it becomes too much work to manage all those pieces, that's when you should be looking at putting something in place that helps that particular issue. But that's just one way to drive employee engagement. But it's a core piece. If you don't fundamentally understand what the vision the employee has for themselves, you're never going to be able to put things in their path that helps them achieve that vision. So you have to have that conversation first. The platform doesn't matter until you have the habit. Get the habit, work out the process, then put the platform in.
Very, very helpful and actionable. And ultimately, it's the muscle that is most important, and what the kind of transfer of value and the creator of value is. That's the key piece, and software is there to support and augment that process. Now, if we're thinking about organizations of, say, 500 and higher, let's say there's a culture already in place in terms of it not being a particularly robust development feedback culture, but there's some normal things. There are one-on-ones, maybe they provide a subscription to Udemy or things like that, but they want to shift into a more continuous feedback, continuous development type of culture. Are there particular things they can do to shift gears when they're already an organization of that size and have a culture that is probably relatively entrenched? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So if the culture is already established and the habits in terms of the mechanical behaviors are in place, the next thing that you need to do is you've already established the feedback culture. How are you actually taking that and extending that into action? This is where you will likely need some mechanisms in place so you can measure over time. So let's say if I'm reporting into you, Evan, and I want to build capability and learn Python because I have a side project that I want to get proficient in this, then that's where you need to ask yourself as a leader, what resources in our organization do we have, people, process, and technology perspective that will get this employee closer to what they need from their development perspective. So that could be a stipend, a program, a platform, an LMS, any number of things. But once you have that, how are you driving along with that employee their progress to that goal? Here are the tools that will help you get this thing. You need to revisit that periodically, and you need to keep that organized so you don't forget about it. What often happens, and this is one of the things, this is not an Engage Rocket conversation, but we fill the gap on taking the information that you're hearing and helping you put it into action, because oftentimes what happens is that you get a bunch of information and you start the process of putting it into action, but you get so buried on the day-to-day stuff that you forget about those initiatives. And so the mechanism to constantly revisit and gauge progress against those goals is where a system is going to help you streamline that. So it's not enough to have the intel. You have to have the enablement to go act on it and the resources in place that allow you to empower that employee to achieve that goal in a number of different ways. It's not a one size like linear equation.
How does Engage Rocket do that?
So there's a couple of different ways that we do it. First thing that we do is we level set with understanding what does the landscape look like. I think one of the gaps that exists within many organizations is that there's a lack of self-awareness at all levels of the organization in terms of what strengths and weaknesses are. We define those out, and then we feed action items to leadership that help you collaborate with your reports and build a customized action plan. Think of that on a quarterly basis. Now, if you want to drill that down to the day-to-day and measure progress, we have other mechanisms integrated into Teams that will help you build that historical trend line of all the different development activities, the feedback activities that really make this a part of your day-to-day. And that's one of the things that's a gap in the marketplace, is that everybody can provide you the information. It's taking the information, putting it into action and making it a habit and having it be an integrated part of your work life is where a lot of these things lose steam. And you would be stunned to hear how many conversations I have with leaders of various organizations that have 2 or 3 different solutions in place, and they're all like, well, this didn't work. Part of the reason it didn't work is there's a change management process, but there's also an element of converting the thing into a habit that lives and breathes in your day-to-day.
Yeah. The insights are valuable, but almost only to the extent that those insights turn into some type of action. Right? You could tell me everything about exercise and nutrition, but I have to exercise and eat well and to capture the benefits of it.
Yeah, I think when you look at the distribution of resources for these sort of things, when you think about coaching, when you think about different sort of psychometric instruments or analysis instruments, where is all of that allocated at the top of the organization? So if you look at coaching, hiring a coach to develop leaders, that happens at the senior and executive levels. It's always struck me as a little odd because when you look at where the work is done on the front lines. One of the big reasons why people leave organizations, aside from manager issues, is because they have no clue, if you're an individual contributor, how the work connects to the broader purpose of the organization and who is the conduit that helps connect those dots. It's your line level managers. So you have an over-index of resources being put at the top of the organization, but the most impact happens at the front lines and you're ignoring that segment of your organizational structure. And then we wonder, why can't we keep our people? Because managers are running in survival mode. Your individual contributors are running in survival mode. You need to think about these things from a systemic perspective versus a seniority perspective.
Well, I could talk about this stuff all day with you.
Samesies.
But didn't realize we are now over time. Certainly value your time. So I'll have to try and pull you back on one of these days. I have about 30 additional questions I would like to pick your brain on. Thank you so much for making the time for us today and sharing some invaluable insights with our audience. Is there anywhere that they can tune in and follow and keep an eye on your content?
I'm active on LinkedIn, so throw me a connection out there. You can find me on the HR Impact podcast. I also produce Building Sales Teams for Lucas Price. So I'm pretty easy to find, but feel free to email me, jim.k@engagerocket.co.
Awesome. Jim, thank you so much. We'll talk very soon.
Cool. Thanks for having me.